Hello YouTubers. Well, now we're going to do another installment on reloading. But first, I'm going to put a name up here. See if any of you are familiar with this guy. W.B. Mershon. I will be covering him much more in depth in other videos, at least one other video later. But you can Google him. I'm just curious if any of you out there have any idea who this is. Okay, now, on to the reloading. Since installment 3, and we're going to cover primers and gunpowder. Boy, getting old really sucks. At one time I had a vocabulary level of 5 years of college. Now I don't know if it's much above 9th grade. If you don't use it, you lose it. You really do. But anyway, the thing about primers is the beginning of it all, and they hardly ever fail. It's really rare to have a primer fail. If the primer is struck, it goes bang. It's a special incendiary device, has a little explosive inside it, and when something hits the center of it, it unleashes a small explosion which ignites whatever it's next to, which is gunpowder when it's loaded in the shell. I have some different types of primers here. We've got Federal, CCI, Winchester, CCI. That's all I got is Federals. I had another brand, but I used all those up. Oh, I remember those were lost in the flood. This is what I've gotten since then. Anyway, the important thing about primers is they're fairly stable. I mean, you can order hulls that have the primers already in them, and you don't have to pay a hazmat fee to receive them. But still, I try to be careful with them. And you don't want to substitute a primer. Like if you're using, say, a Federal shell, you should use a Federal primer. Because each primer, because of the varying characteristics, produces a little bit different pressure inside the gun when it goes off. So substituting it, you can end up with too much pressure, especially if you got a Magnum steel load that is close to the edge anyway, and then you substitute the primer, you could be into a danger zone with it. The one that you can usually get away with substituting is CCI. They don't seem to produce a lot of pressure. Of course, I have to give you a disclaimer, but I mean, I'm not telling you to do it. But from what I read in the Status of Steel, I believe it was, it said that is the one brand that you can put in place of others. Otherwise, you shouldn't substitute Federal for Winchester or Winchester for Fiocchi or anything like that. So that's primers. Now for gunpowder. Of course, I have a selection. This is unique. I really don't like it. I don't like that gunpowder. It burns fast enough that if you trying to use it with steel shot is always tricky. Little gun, which is used for 410s and some 20 gauge loads and stuff. There's actually some recipes for the heavyweight tungsten with 20 gauge involving those. Blue Dot, which was always a good basic Magnum slow burning powder. Steel, which in my mind has pretty much replaced Blue Dot, because whenever you have a recipe for Blue Dot, the same recipe with steel usually has about 100 feet per second faster velocity, and it's more resistant to cold weather than Blue Dot. And E3, there's some recipes for steel shot with those. That's a faster burning powder though. Anyway, most of these are double base powders, which means they have the main explosive ingredient is nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin. A single base powder just has nitrocellulose. And these all have, these are all double based, I believe. I think even this one's double based. But the faster burning powders are cleaner, they burn cleaner, they tend to leave less residue in the barrel. Your slow burning magnum powders tend to leave more stuff in the barrel. And cold weather affects all of these, but this one here, Blue Dot, I don't recommend making loads of these if you're going to be shooting anything below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I really don't. This just goes to crap. It loses all kinds of power. I did not originally know that a long time ago, and I was hunting with 10 gauge using reloads, and it was about 15 degrees outside, and I was having trouble knocking birds down. I couldn't figure out why. And this other guy that I ran into occasionally out there, he said that my gun didn't sound as loud as it usually does. I thought that was interesting. I did more research and found out that Blue Dot is notorious for losing power in cold weather. You see, nitroglycerin freezes somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It freezes, so it's not going to work as good. So usually, if you're going to be hunting in really cold weather, you want to use a little faster burning powder. But the trade-off is that with the faster burning powder, you cannot load heavy magnum loads. You just can't. It generates too much pressure, and it will have all kinds of nasty results, like the shell blowing up in the gun, and shell casing splitting apart or blowing out the back, and all kinds of bad stuff. So they have recipes in Status of Steel and the Advantages Manual, and if you're going to use the faster burning powder recipes, follow them to the letter, because if you try to make a hotter load out of it, it's going to be a hotter load, alright, but it's going to be, you're not going to be happy with the result. Something else I want to point out is gunpowders are quite different. For instance, steel, this is an older bottle of steel. They changed the coloration and package at some point. Take a look. The grains are pretty big. Steel has big grains. It's hard to meter on some reloading machines. I have a little trouble with it. But for instance, if you look at, let's see, little gun for instance, little gun has little tiny grains. Real tiny. Now, people talk about, well, these have nitroglycerin in them. Good God, they might blow up. The thing of it is, it's not going to blow up. In fact, your it's a good idea to blend it every time you go to use it, because there's different additives in it, and oh yeah, that's something else I was going to show you. Blue Dot is called Blue Dot for a reason. If you haven't used it, you'll see what I'm talking about. It has little blue dots. They also have green dot and red dot. Red dot is a really fast burning powder. It's called Alliant, but it used to be called Hercules. I remember a long, long time ago it was called Hercules. And I don't know why they changed the name, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, so you should blend these, and when you put it in the press, once you're done reloading whatever batch you're making, you should not leave it in there, because if you leave it in there, it can draw moisture from the room. It's best to keep gunpowder in its original container. These containers are made to, say you get a fire, they're not going to go boom like you'd think they would. They'll just, I'll show you a demonstration here in a minute. It's actually not very spectacular. In fact, if you take a load of steel powder here, let's see, 35, 36. A typical load that I would use in a 10 gauge well, we'll use less than that. I'm not real comfortable with that. About half that. I'll show you something. Now you would think, gunpowder would go boom and blow up. But this slow burning powder has to have water pressure. For instance, I take and I pour right here, and I light it. That's all it does. It didn't go boom, but it does produce an extremely hot fire and very hot gases, and that's what propels your shot. This is another powder I use, Hodgdon Longshot. It's also a Magnum type powder for heavy hunting loads. That's what I was using with the heavyweight tungsten, knocking those snow geese down last year. Unfortunately, I'm getting low on it, and I'm having trouble finding gunpowder, so I may have to use a different recipe. One of the local gun shops had 1 pound container of this, and they wanted $50 because of the shortage. I told them, I said, it can wait. I'll come up with a different recipe. I am not going to get scalped for gunpowder. It's not happening. Of course, I used to use black powder, which actually is an explosive. It doesn't require to be compressed. One thing I was going to mention about primers, about the varying pressures. Inside the Lyman book, there's a table in here shows they had did a variation test with 12 gauge 7/8 ounce target load. Using the CCI, they had velocity 1180, pressure was 7,700 feet per second, PSI rather. The Remington 209 primer, velocity was 1187 and pressure was 8,200 PSI. Fiat, velocity was 1196 feet per second and pressure was 9,000 PSI. The Federal 209A was 1195 feet per second, pressure was 9,100 PSI. And the CCI 209M, the Magnum primer, 1217 and 10,200 PSI. So it had, they all varied, it was all the same load, but the pressure varied between 7,000 and 10,000. So that's something that you have to watch out for. And that was a CCI Magnum primer. A regular primer would probably reduce, have less pressure. They've got a note in here that says that for the specific target load used in the alignment test, the Federal 209A primer produces pressure at 138% of that produced by the CCI 209 primer. This is more than a substantial increase. If the original load had produced the maximum allowable pressure with the CCI primer, then the Federal primer would have resulted in pressure exceeding 15,800 PSI. And the velocity didn't change much in all that, so you definitely want to stick with the correct primer. Another thing the alignment book has is a powder burning rate chart. And it shows all these different gunpowders. There's 134 of them. And they're numbered from 1 is the fastest burning and 134 is the slowest. And of course I've got marks on the ones that I use in there, where they are. Of course, it says you're not supposed to extrapolate data from that table, but how can you not? You know, it's kind of hard not to. But, you know, it's a disclaimer. Now, the next thing I was going to discuss is black powder. And black powder, which we generally don't use anymore. The reason I brought that up is one of the specs on shotgun shell boxes. For instance, these older, like I picked up a bunch of older 10 gauge ammunition, and here it is, it says 4.5 drams equivalent. Drams equivalent, now what is that? Well, drams is a unit of black powder, and this is actually a velocity spec. They don't say what the velocity is on there. You know, nowadays they just print the velocity, but the idea was it took a certain number of drams of black powder to push a certain load at a certain speed. So this is 4.5 drams equivalent. And there's actually a table in the Advantage manual that shows drams equivalent and what the velocity would be for a given load. And some of these 10 gauge boxes just says max drams equivalent, which is, I don't know how much that is. But I looked it up, and if you convert it, 1 dram is supposed to equal 27.3438 grains. So you can see where 4 or 5 drams equivalent would be. That's a lot of powder. So if you're going to load the same shells with black powder, you would have to use an awful lot of it. Anyway, I only learned about that recently. All this time I'd seen that on the boxes and didn't really know what it meant exactly. Oh, and by the way, when you spill gunpowder, they don't recommend using a vacuum cleaner to clean it up because, of course, if the vacuum is designed where the suction goes through the electric motor, of course there could be sparking, and well, that could be detrimental. I think, to me, in my mind, I think that if the vacuum is designed to where the motor is clear past all that, where the gunpowder would never go through it, I don't see a problem. But generally, it's not recommended to use vacuum. You usually should use just a little whisk broom or something like that. Something else I failed to mention about primers. This is a primer pocket conditioner. I use it for a RAM a lot of times, but what happens is the primer pocket, where the primer goes, can end up getting wallowed out a little bit. It'll get kind of loose, and you'll know because when you have the primer in there and you load everything else in there and crimp the shell, and then you notice the primer is trying to back out a little bit. So what you do on that, shell sits on top like this. Well, I need to get a shell that don't have a primer in it. And shell, here we go. Shell sits on there like that, and this goes down through the middle. And sometimes it's a pain in the butt to hold it up. Okay. You see how it goes in there like that. Now, you take a hammer and you beat this thing several times, and it actually makes the primer pocket tighter. And it does work. And one problem, or one thing I noticed is the Fiocchi shells and, what's the other brand? It's just like them. The Cheddite. The Cheddite and the Fiocchi shells. Both, if you put a CCI or some other primer in there, a CCI primer will fit kind of loose in there. Whereas the Cheddite primer and the Fiocchi primer fit correct. There's a slight difference in size. And I've actually taken, okay, disclaimer, I'm not recommending you do this, but I actually took a Cheddite shell and used the pocket conditioner to tighten the primer pocket, and I was able to use a CCI primer in it. And it fit nice and tight. So, it's a handy little thing. It's a tool that you should have if you reload, because there's going to be times that you're going to have variations in hulls. I'll be talking about hulls in a different video. Anyway, there's something I was going to use. Someone asked me, there was a request for a leaky load. Someone wanted me to show them how to do a leaky load, which I don't, normally we did that with lead, because back in the day when I was reloading lead, we used fiber wads, these things, and we didn't have a plastic shot cap. Those were new, those were being introduced. Remington had them, they called it their power piston system. And so we used those. Of course, you're going to have leak in pressure naturally. That's why the shells required a high wad pressure, because they would tend to lose pressure after a while. But I will make one. I'll go ahead and make one here on the bench with steel shot. Actually, I'll use the tungsten heavyweight 7s. And I'll test it out at some point. I have no idea if it's going to work properly or not, but it's for demonstration purposes. Normally, you'd use it for lead. But if you have an old gun and you want to do everything authentic, like back in the day, you could do that. So, without further ado, let's take I'll use what, 20 gauge, I guess. We'll do 20 gauge. How's that? And we will use little gun. digging out. There it is. Now this is how I use the press too, by the way. I know it's time consuming, but let's see, the recipe calls for, the pressure will be less actually than with a plastic shot cap, because the plastic shot cap helps seal it a lot better, holds the pressure better. So, 20 gauge, 2 3/4 inch length, little gun, 35 grains of powder. Okay, so 35, let's look at 25, 35, there we go. It's actually 35 grains of powder is quite a bit for a 20 gauge in any book. Hopefully you can see this okay. I'm going to move these. And the CDs go flying. Okay, I'll straighten that out later. I really got to get this shop organized. It's a disaster area. It really is, which I plan to do, but turkey season, I got one more day of turkey season, then I got time to do stuff at home. And I can straighten all this out. So I take a scoop, a little gun, and start filling it. A little bit much. Be interesting to see what velocity this comes out at. I've never done a leaky load with steel or tungsten, but tungsten behaves more like lead than steel does, so it's probably a better choice. Okay, that's on 0, so that's precise. Put this in here like so. I may have to add it on. I may have to use more. Normally we use 1 wad, but I'm thinking it's probably going to take 2 or 3 because the tungsten is so heavy. Put it on the press here. And then this is where I use the primer pockets and to make sure that the wad is down all the way. It is. There's still a lot of room there, so I'm going to put another one in there. And that came out to right there. Okay. Now, it's a 1 ounce, I'm not sure that's down all the way. So 1 ounce load, so scale here, 28 grams, 1 ounce. Usually go by grams because it's a little bit more precise than ounce. Because one time I agree with the metric system. Most of the time it's a pain in the butt to me. I hate it because I go to buy tools, I got to buy 2 sets of everything. It irritates me. 28 grams. Back in the day, we didn't have the metric system for hardly anything. Everything was standard system. Alright, 1 ounce of, let me double check, make sure it actually is calls for an ounce. Yep, 1 ounce. Oh, it's pretty close, just a little bit low. As you can see, it's just barely below the crimp line. So I think to make up for that, I'm going to put in I'm going to use an overshot wad anyway, but I think I'm going to add another fiber wad and I'm going to cut it. You should have a utility knife for stuff like this. Cut this fiber wad down. And that's going to put it on the If you end up too high, you can always roll crimp it, which roll crimping is something else I will cover later as well. There's really so much information when it comes to reloading. So that is going to come out pretty good. So I put a fiber wad on top, which is not exactly standard, but I did it for space. I also could have put it underneath the shot. And then I put an over shot card on it. And this over here. And crimp starter. And there we go. Normally I would have actually pushed it down more. But I don't know what the wad pressure is. It should be pretty good though, and from the feel of it, it felt like probably about 50 pounds. Seemed like some of the early shells, seemed like the wad pressures were like 70 pounds or something like that. Pretty high. The crimp came out pretty good. I need to write on here what this is. Leaky load. Heavyweight. It'll be interesting shooting that to see how that performs. Now, a variation of that you could do, and I would recommend it, unless you're wanting to be as authentic as possible. I would recommend these right here. Gas seal. You put a gas seal in that sucker, it's going to hold pressure really good. Because gas seal is really tight in there. The one thing about a leaky load like this is there's no shot cut. So if you've got an old gun where the choke was designed for no shot cut, you're going to be right on the money with it. It's going to be exactly the way it's supposed to be. Whereas if you're shooting a shot cut through an old gun, it's not precise. It's actually a little tighter than it's supposed to be. That's going to be an interesting shell. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I was going to cover regarding gunpowder. I think that's probably about it. I think next time we'll probably cover hulls. And because there's actually enough information you need to know about it. Because there are some differences in hulls that are worth noting that could lead to some shells that don't work properly if not properly done. Anyway, I want to thank my Patreon supporters, and I want to thank anyone who watches in general. I definitely want to thank the Patreon supporters because you guys actually put up money to help cover expenses, and that definitely helps. Makes it easier to continue doing this. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/ZCoop, I believe is what it is, and you'll find me there. Definitely would be appreciated. I appreciate all you guys. I appreciate people sticking with me even when there's big gaps in the time between videos. It has to do, a lot of it has to do with my job, my daily job. I've been doing a lot of overtime lately, a lot. It seems like the Biden administration, or in my opinion, the people who are squatting in the White House, but that's my opinion. And I guarantee YouTube doesn't agree with my opinion. But anyway, the people who currently are supposedly in charge, they're making it to where it's an incentive to not work because you can just get unemployment and make more money than you could on some jobs. So what is the point? And because of that, we have what I call the second pandemic, which is a pandemic of, or at least an epidemic. It's a problem of widespread lack of employees, lack of staff at all kinds of businesses. And you can't get decent service anywhere because of that. Everyone's short-staffed, and we are definitely short-staffed. We build RVs for people, and we're having trouble getting the production out because we're short-staffed, and so we have to work overtime, those of us who still have a work ethic. In my opinion, this business of overpaying unemployment is a sales pitch for communism. That's my opinion. Whether you agree with it or not, you're welcome to comment either way. You could say, hey, your opinion sucks, you're wrong, you know, Biden's a great guy and all that. I'll listen to your comments, whatever they are. The only ones that I'll erase are ones that are like personal attacks on me, that are just flat out inappropriate and mean. Normally I'll leave comments posted. And even the mean ones I'll leave posted for a while before I take them down. Anyway, that was kind of a long rant for nothing. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button. It helps the algorithm to keep the video up. It gives them less of a reason to take it down, especially when I start ranting about government or anything. I don't hate government. They have an important place, but they're a little too big at the moment. Actually, they're quite a bit too big, in my opinion. Our founding fathers are rolling in their grave. But I know there's people out there who watch my videos who probably are liberals, and that's okay. We need the diversity. It's important to have different opinions about things. If everyone thought the same, it would be really a boring country to live in. So thanks for watching.